Good evening. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming. Let me begin by acknowledging the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, including lead sponsor Bank of America, Boston Capital, the Boston Foundation, the Lowell Institute, Raytheon, and our media partners WBUR and, assuming there's no conflict of interest here, the Boston Globe. And we thank the Globe's publisher, Chris Mayer, who is here with us this evening for that ongoing support. We are here tonight to mark the awarding of the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for Criticism to Sebastian Smee for his vivid and exuberant writing about art, often bringing great works to life with love and appreciation. Much of the work of this library and the men and women we honor here depends on a vibrant free press, and this city is fortunate to have such a venerable and renowned daily newspaper. My mornings are often lightened when I come down to our kitchen and see one of my children having breakfast while reading the Boston Globe. The tradition lives on. So when learning of Sebastian Smee's award this spring, we propose crafting a panel featuring him and other past Pulitzer Prize-winning Globe journalists, including, and I will quote from their original award citations, although I will quote Charles Savage first, and he is en route and flight, and he'll be here in just a few minutes. Charles Savage, whose national reporting in 2007 revealed how President Bush often used signing statements to assert his controversial right to bypass provisions of new laws. Walter Robinson, for the Globe's courageous, comprehensive coverage of sexual abuse by priests in 2003, an effort that pierced secrecy, stirred local, national, and international reaction, and produced changes in the Roman Catholic Church. Ellen Goodman, who won the Pulitzer in 1980 for distinguished commentary, a reporter for 10 years before ever writing a column. The joke at the time was that her editor, Tom Winship, made Ellen a columnist in an effort to get her opinions out of the newsroom. And Tom Oliphant, who earned his Pulitzer in 1975 as part of the Globe's massive and balanced coverage of the Boston school desegregation crisis. One of our favorite moderators, Tom often reminds us through his amazing recall of arcane historical and political facts that an Oliphant never forgets. And just as a group of talented musicians cannot truly become an orchestra without a conductor, our daily paper comes to us through the orchestration of the Globe's editor, Marty Barron, who we've asked to share a few words to launch this evening's discussion. Before joining the Globe a decade ago, Mr. Barron held top editing positions at the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Miami Herald. Under his leadership, the Globe has won 5 Pulitzer Prizes. Let me conclude with an excerpt from a recent review of the Museum of Fine Arts written by Sebastian Smee after returning to the Art of the Americas wing a few months after its historic opening. The experience made me freshly alive to how much about the whole project succeeds, not just passively, but quite brilliantly. There is so much subtlety in the hang, so many surprising connections that speak volumes, and so much variety in the styles of display. The ambition of the whole undertaking alone is thrilling. And the same might be said for the audacity of all those who publish one of our country's finest daily newspapers, with stories that enlighten our minds and connect us to others, a noble endeavor that often succeeds brilliantly in helping us to be freshly alive to the world around us. Please join me now in welcoming Marty Barron and our distinguished panel of Pulitzer Prize winners to the Kennedy Library.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Tom and the Kennedy Library, for hosting a program that champions journalism of the highest ambition and standards. Ever since the first Pulitzer Prizes were awarded in 1917, they have been a call to excellence for journalists. The journalists on the podium, the panelists, and our distinguished moderator, Tom Oliphant, all of them treasured colleagues of mine, have answered that call by every measure. Let me just say a few quick words about these extraordinary panelists and Pulitzer winners. First, Ellen Goodman. Upon her retirement in 2010, from regular writing on the Globe's op-ed page, her colleague James Carroll penned a much-deserved testimonial. Ellen had become, he wrote, one of those who transformed the question of gender inequality into the second great civil rights movement. And he continued, the pace of life, intimate relationships, sexuality removed from reproduction, workplace transformations, how we die, environmental degradation, men and women at war, matrimonial rights, and rights in marriage. With ancient assumptions undercut, this indispensable columnist regularly offered a model of moral reasoning while always making clear how these are not, quote, women's issues, but belong to us all. We certainly miss Ellen at the Globe, and I know that many of our readers do as well. Next, I'll mention Charlie Savage, who I guess will be here any minute. Hope so. You know, Charlie's now at a pretty good newspaper, the New York Times. But I'll wager that he'll always be remembered for his work, his path-breaking work at the Boston Globe. Charlie won for his stories, as Tom mentioned, on how George W. Bush's expanded use of signing statements allowed the president to disregard laws that had been passed by Congress. And after Charlie won the Pulitzer Prize, many noted that he and the Globe were typically a lonely voice drawing attention to an aggressive, unprecedented, and possibly extra-constitutional expansion of presidential power. At the time, I remarked publicly that Charlie won because he covers what the White House does, not just what it says. We can certainly use more of that among the press corps in Washington, and we can all be glad that Charlie is still there doing it. Sebastian Smee. At the Globe, we're of course delighted that Sebastian traveled across an ocean and then a continent, all the way from Australia to join us 2+ years ago. I can tell you that he gets a ton of fan mail, and readers, not just prize judges, adore his work. A few years ago, before joining us, Sebastian wrote an essay about what constituted good criticism. Good criticism, he wrote in expressing an ideal, quote, should be risky, challenging, candid, and vulnerable. It should be urbane one moment, gauchely heartfelt the next. It should kick against cant where it sees it and cherish and applaud not only art, but the impulse to make art. For that impulse, which comes out of life as it is lived, is the real mystery and the source of everything that makes it wonderful. Sebastian lives up to that ideal, and it's exactly why his work has such popular appeal. Hi, Charlie. I just said really nice things about you. I hope you heard them all. I'll show you my text afterwards. Finally, Walter Robinson. The investigation that Robbie led into a decades-long cover-up of sexual abuse by priests within the Catholic Church has emerged as one of the biggest stories of our time. Robbie is deeply respected for his skill and his integrity, and for his iron determination to hold powerful institutions and individuals accountable. This certainly gets noticed in the circles of the mighty, but most gratifying is what we hear from entirely different corners of society. Now, on my desk, I keep a 2-page letter. This is a letter that Robbie received on the 5th anniversary of the first Spotlight Team story on the church. It was written by an abuse victim, someone who went on to become an advocate for victims. And it begins, Dear Walter, for several years, I've thought about writing this letter. Virtually every time I think about it, I tear up. Today, I've resolved to finish it regardless. And it continues. Here's a long overdue, painfully inadequate, but deeply heartfelt thank you, Walter, to you, your Spotlight Team colleagues, and the rest of the deserving Globe staff for easing my personal pain, along with the still unimaginable pain of so many of my peers. I believe that our horrific collective Childhood trauma and adult suffering has not been in vain. Your work has made this belief a reality. At the Globe, we take pride in our Pulitzer Prizes, of course, but we also know this: the best of journalism brings rewards greater than any prize. Thank you all for coming.
So here we go. And this is a real challenge, not to let this degenerate into a situation where you got a bunch of young and old journalists telling telling war stories like we were in a saloon late at night. And it will be a challenge, and I'll need your help to pull it off. You know, in case you hadn't noticed, every once in a while, we in the newspaper racket screw up and make colossal, horrid mistakes. But also, every so often, we get it right. And all too often, the study of this racket focuses on the pathology, the mistakes. We're going to try to talk a little bit about how things go right, and occasionally very, very right, using as our framework some awards that were first formed in the will of one of the great 19th century press barons, Joseph Pulitzer, who, like most of his colleagues, was both a great visionary and a true scoundrel. His legacy included the New York World, now gone, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, still very much with us. But it also included a bequest to honor the best in journalism in perpetuity. And Pulitzer had the sense, when he died, his will made provision, believe it or not, for just 4 journalism awards. But it contained language to permit the board, at Columbia it turns out, to expand or contract the list as time passed, depending on what they saw in the business that needed recognition or didn't need so much anymore. And sure enough, as happens in almost any system, it didn't contract, it grew. In fact, you could almost say, like a cancer, it metastasized. Today there are 21 journalism Pulitzer Prizes. And for those who sometimes criticize the Pulitzer system for diluting excellence instead of saluting it, you could almost say that everything is honored today except spelling. But this is a little different because we're not talking about dilution here. And down the road and across Morrissey Boulevard, Pulitzer Prizes have been a kind of punctuation mark for the evolution of the Boston Globe into excellence and status in the country and in the world. It all started in 1965, the year the late Tom Winship took control of the editorial side of the paper, when Senator Edward Kennedy made one of his many mistakes in public life, putting forward the name of a hack friend of his father's, Francis X. Morrissey, for a federal judgeship here. And it was one of those stories that started slow. What is this guy doing getting nominated for a judgeship? What are his qualifications? Before anyone knew it, Tom had assembled a team of people to examine Morrissey's background, and despite considerable political pressure, kept going until the name was withdrawn. And the following year, the Pulitzer Committee awarded the Globe the first Pulitzer Prize of Tom's era. There would be, I think, 14 before he retired. Sadly, he died in 2002. But since then, the prizes have almost defined the Globe's emergence pretty damn well, actually. And with your forbearance, I'm going to talk to each of my distinguished colleagues a little bit about their work, try to encourage them to talk some among themselves. And then in about 40 minutes, there are 2 microphones, one there and one there, and I will encourage you to line up at them to ask your own questions of us, keeping in mind just one thing. We're all writers, not editors. One person here represents the Globe, the rest of us used to, but none of us speaks for it. But we do encourage your questions and hope. So with that, I thought I'd do seniority, if that's okay, and turn to my good buddy, Ellen Goodman. I remember vividly, Ellen, in 1980, when the announcement was made about your work in 1979, because what you were trying to do hadn't been really done before. Not in column writing in general, and certainly not on the op-ed pages of a major newspaper. And I wish you could tell us a little bit about how the idea for this column took shape in your head, and what it was like to try to get it established in a place like the Globe in the mid-1970s.
Well, I suppose the idea for the column took root in the Times, as well as in the Globe. I mean Times, small t. And in the Times, there was, I had begun covering the women's movement, and one of the slogans of the women's movement was, "The personal is political." Now, this is before Anthony Weiner took it to a new extreme. But at that time, the notion the personal is political meant that changing diapers could be a statement about political life, how breast cancer was treated in the medical bill, how all of these allegedly child care was both personal and political. And the idea that the personal was political infused my thinking about how to write. I was determined that I would write across the fences that divided both journalism, men and women, and the way we thought about our culture. So that up until those times, for the most part, you had Irma Bombeck writing humor, and you had David Broder even then writing in politics. But you had a strict division between the personal and the political. And this was not a reflection of how we lived, and it was not a reflection of the way my own thinking was evolving in tune with the time. So I determined to write about the personal and the political, about politics in the traditional sense, but also private life and the way these two intersected. And so when I first began writing for the Globe, I was writing on the living page, which was frankly more open to this idea than the op-ed page.
We'll get to that in a second, because the openness of that page has a great deal to do with the foundation that this kid built on, right?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
And
then as time went on, I think at a certain time in history, a Pulitzer never would have been awarded to someone who wrote about child care, or someone who wrote about our personal relationships, or how men and women interacted, or social change. And as time went on, both with the Pulitzer imprimatur, but also with beginning to syndicate, and then finding the column on the op-ed page, that changed.
Just to put this in a historical context, when we started at the Globe, was the department still called Women?
Yes. When I started at the Globe, and I was hired for the women's section, which we used to call Back There, even though I had previously worked. I had previously worked in the newsroom at the Detroit Free Press, but I was hired for the Globe Back There. and by the way, took the job immediately because I was pregnant. So whatever job they offered, I was taking. They didn't know I was pregnant, which always made me nervous about the Globe's doctor. But so,
you weren't the only one.
No, story for another day. Right.
But it was the women's page.
It was the women's page.
And did the column start on? I don't know who held the contest to name the section 40 years ago, but living became the word, and that's where the column started, right?
Yeah, it did.
And moving it to the op-ed page was your idea, Tom's idea?
Well, actually, it started appearing on the op-ed page of the Washington Post.
That's what did it. Meg Greenfield.
and prior to Meg.
And
Phil Jalen actually put it there so that the Globe, it was kind of a, what's wrong with this picture? And we moved it to the op-ed page in the Globe.
A final, one of the purposes, and I want to talk to Sebastian about this in a few minutes because his work is so unusual. One of the purposes of a Pulitzer Prize, when it really works, is that it encourages a good trend right at the moment it's first forming. And I was wondering if, looking back, Ellen, the acknowledgement of your work spurred more of this in America? What's your assessment of the impact of all of this on people's effort to introduce the personal to pages that are used to be political?
It's very hard to take out what the Pulitzer meant versus what just being syndicated meant versus what was happening in the culture at the time. I think it's almost impossible to pull one of those strings out.
Indeed. Now, it's almost a cliche in newspapering, but almost every great story has a great story behind it. And the pal of mine over here hasn't always had the opportunity to tell the backstory to what happened with the Catholic Church. Do you begin with a court case that had some sealed documents? It didn't just happen. The evolution of a story like this in some ways is as fascinating as the story itself. Tell us a little bit about how this started, Robbie.
I'll try to remember.
We all take ginkgo now every 5 minutes.
First of all, thank you all for abandoning your beach chairs early this afternoon to be here on this lovely, lovely summer evening. I'd have to start by saying that good journalism is never possible without good editors and gutsy publishers. And I have had, in a very long career at the Globe, the great good fortune to work for great editors and great publishers. And this particular endeavor, which started in 2001, started because of Marty Barron. And Marty won't tell you that, but not a story would have been written nor conceived had he not, on his very first day as Globe editor, wandered in and, pardon me for saying wandered in, but strode purposely into a news meeting. Got myself out of trouble on that one. And referring to a column Eileen McNamara had just written about a certain one priest, John Gagan, Marty said, "Why are the documents in that court case sealed? We have to get at them." And that fresh set of eyes inside of a head with a fertile mind is what started this. By the end of that day, if my memory serves me, or certainly within a day, the Globe's lawyer was looking into how the Globe could go into court and ask for those records of one priest. And that day, I was in Marty's office in the afternoon as the editor of the Spotlight team, and we were accustomed to going after crooked politicians and no-show public employees and all that. And I'm in his office, and he said, I'd like the Spotlight team to look into the case of Father Gagan and find out everything you can.
Was this a criminal case?
No, it was a civil case with over 80 plaintiffs. And the public knew almost nothing about what the church knew because all the documents were secret. So the court case where we, in effect, took on the archdiocese in a courtroom began, but the investigation began at the same moment. And I have to tell you, I was a little frightened to death because I had a new editor who would have control over at least my Christmas bonus. And I said, I don't know anything. I mean, I went to high school next door at BC High. I had a Catholic upbringing, but I knew nothing about the Catholic Church, and the idea of investigating it was something that took a while to get my hands around. But
considering, too, Robbie, the effect that the church had, that they were always right in the building when there was any kind of an issue.
That is true. I mean, to say that within Boston, the church was treated with great deference by everybody, and as we found out, by police and prosecutors as well, when some of these issues surfaced quietly in prior years. But after some time of trying to find out, and I want to say about a week, about Father Gagan, we hadn't made much progress. But we had found out something else, and I remember going back to Marty and saying, we're still working on Gagan, but what we have found out is that Gagan is the tip of the iceberg, that there are apparently some large number of other priests who have done the same thing, and the church has covered up this activity for decades. And at the time, I thought, and we thought in the Spotlight team, perhaps there were a dozen or 15 priests involved. And that was August. That was the end of July. By January, when we started to publish initially about Father Gagan, we already knew that there were likely 100 or more priests just in the Boston Catholic Archdiocese who had abused children, and in almost every case, and this was the story, the bishops and the cardinals who were responsible for the welfare and the safety of all of these children had actively concealed the crimes and in many cases facilitated them. And that's how the story started. And
tell me one other thing, because at least Ellen and I know something about the past relationships with the church around here. Did you have any personal experiences with the kind of pressure the Archdiocese was deservedly famous for bringing to bear in that building down the road?
No, never. I don't think had ever written much, if anything, about the church. I mean, I covered politics for years, and we all know the church never gets involved in it.
Never. No. At least not around here.
But, you know, one of the wonderful things about the Globe is that for reporters, if there is ever any pressure brought to bear on the publisher or even on the editor, nothing would have been said to me. Period.
It was a tradition. It's true now, I gather. It was certainly true in my day. It's a very important thing. A well-run newspaper, a newspaper with character, shields its people from this, even while it's going on. It is going on. It's just that a good publisher and a good editor doesn't let him. I want to ask you one other thing, Rod. By the way, the award that the Globe got for this incredible bit of work is the award for public service. And it's one of three that go all the way back to Pulitzer's original will. And it is the only award that goes to a newspaper or an institution as opposed to an individual. The only others that have survived from the beginning of all this are cartooning, interestingly enough, and editorial writing. Everything else has come in recent years. The award, for example, that Ellen got, I think, dates from 1970. Too late for, say, Walter Lippmann or Joe Alsop or people like that who wrote them. The first Pulitzer Prize, if memory serves, went to Marquis Childs of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Very political, very Washington. And in 10 years, everything had changed. In Charlie's case, again, this all dates from the 60s and the 50s, dividing reporting up among international, national, and local. And same thing with you. It's very recent. But in Robbie's case, if you read the newspaper stories, Robbie, about Pulitzer Prizes, usually the lead each year is the institution that has won the public service award, more often than not. Sometimes it's a big institution like us. Often it's a tiny one that has shown enormous courage in the face of pressure. So the recognition that came to you, and to the Globe, more importantly, was based on the willingness to stand up to institutional wrongdoing. And what's it like a decade later? You look, you see this thing, it's in the Vatican now, there's a case developing in Philadelphia that smells every bit as putrid as Boston did. It's all over Europe. There's been just a heartbreaking series of stories in Ireland. Do you ever have that journalists feel like, what's the point to what I do? It just never stops.
Well, you know, I think in this case, well, when you talk about the recognition, the Globe, we had a team of reporters, I think everybody knows, which started with 4 and grew to 8 when the story literally exploded in early 2002. And I think that first year alone we published 800 or more articles on this issue. I'd have to say it is at times discouraging to read about the fact that this story continues, but it's also heartening because the world literally now pays attention to this issue. People in countries where one would not have expected this, Latin America, I'm thinking, are now raising questions about what their bishops and their priests have done. And I hope, I think this is certainly true in the United States, and I hope that in all of these countries where this story is getting out in one way or another, the children are, in the end, safer. And to me, that's the heartening thing. Even when we read, as we have recently, that somehow the Archdiocese in Philadelphia didn't get the message and still had 37 priests in active ministry who had credible accusations.
Right. The suspicion being, of course, that Philadelphia is anything but unique.
That's correct.
Indeed. Now, if this was institutional, Charlie, in your case, it's personal. It's you. But that's not entirely so. I don't know how many documents Robbie had to look at in 01, 02, and 03. But I have this.
We have a storeroom at the Globe that is literally pages of documents.
But I remember when Winship got me to steal the third batch of Pentagon papers and it was only like this. And sitting in rooms, I mean, of all the things journalists do, reading this stuff is probably the least enjoyable and the most important thing we do. But tell how this started, Charlie. I love backstories. You didn't wake up one morning and have thoughts about signing statements. I suspect.
No, I'd not heard of them, although there was this little foreshadowing, not about Bush, but about the Reagan years, just before this happened, when Sam Alito was being confirmed to the Supreme Court. And his memos were being opened up, and we were all sorting through them at the National Archives down in Washington. And there was a memo about how the Reagan legal team was thinking that this tool, signing statements, was an underutilized tool of executive power, and it could be used to help the president get the last word on how to interpret ambiguous statutes. It could be used to force Congress to do what the president wanted when legislation was in the mix by using the signing statement as a threat. And it could be used to control this term that started popping up in the mid-'80s for the first time, the Unitary executive. And so we'd come across that memo, those of us hunting through Sam Alito, and I was like, what is signing statements? What is that anyway? But separately, I had been, at the time for the Globe, and still now, even for the Times, I was specializing in particular on 9/11 legal policy issues, Guantanamo, torture, these sorts of things were what I spent most of my time thinking about. And so I'd spent 2005 following the debate in Congress, among other things, between Senator John McCain and the Bush administration, essentially as an internecine Republican debate about torture. It had come out when Alberto Gonzales was up to become the Attorney General that the Bush administration had secretly decided that the treaty against torture did not apply overseas through sort of a twisted legal interpretation. This outraged McCain, who of course had been tortured in Vietnam, and he spent that year trying to push through Congress legislation that would close this loophole by making clear that torture is outlawed no matter where in the world the U.S. government is operating, not just on U.S. soil. And the Bush administration hated that law in particular, or that proposition. Dick Cheney was going to Congress to personally lobby behind closed doors not to pass that law, or if they did pass it, to make an exception for CIA interrogations. But in the end, McCain got a vote on the floor of the Senate, and it passed overwhelmingly. I think only 9 senators voted against it. So overwhelmingly that it would have, if Bush had tried to veto it, as he threatened to do, it would have been overridden. And so Bush called McCain into his office and called the cameras in as well, and had this big sort of handshake, and you won and I lost, and maybe this is okay. And that was the story. And so we all wrote that story up and went home, and thinking that the story I'd been following for a year was over. Except that it turned out not to be over, because a few days later the bill finally gets signed by Bush. This was on December 30th, I think. It was the Friday before New Year's Eve, so Washington is shut down, everyone's out of town. And around 8 p.m. that night, the White House sends out an email with its press releases, as it always does, and it just mentions that there's also a signing statement on this bill. And so I came to work after New Year's Eve weekend and was looking at this thing and looking what some law professors were saying about it, and called up the White House to ask them what it meant, because it was spoken in very dense language. It talked about the unitary executive theory again, and commander-in-chief power, and construing the statute consistent with. And
Can you just take a detour and define this theory that has actually been around for more than 20 years, but has been advocated with more strength, particularly on the right in recent years?
Well, so the unitary executive theory began in the Reagan administration as the idea that the president controls the entire executive branch. You don't have a subordinate official who gets to make his own decisions. If the EPA director thinks that the mercury level should be X, but the president thinks it should be Y, the president wins. And that's okay, because the president is the one who controls the executive branch. This, in the Bush administration, changed and evolved. It was fused with the notion that the president controls as commander-in-chief inherent unwritten powers to protect national security as he sees fit. And the idea became the president has to do whatever is necessary to protect national security, and that means that his derivative officials also are under his umbrella as the unitary executive. And so Congress cannot bind the hands of the president or anyone else in the executive branch if the president is telling them what to do.
And even if it does, technically,
well, that's just words on the page. It's not really a law. And so this theory was being invoked in this signing statement, which was an instruction to the military and the CIA that notwithstanding this new statute, the president as commander-in-chief controlled interrogation.
And what was left of the purpose of the statute when the signing statement was read by you that weekend?
Right. Well, so essentially,
did it shred the law?
Well, it reserved the right to shred the law, right? And so it was not clear whether this was going to be acted upon or not, or what it all meant. But what it definitely meant was the president considered himself still free to order any kind of interrogation he wanted. And so I wrote that story, and that got a very big response. And that was interesting, but I sort of went on with my life. I was writing all kinds of different stories. And about 3 months later, there was a similar incident in which a multi-year debate over reauthorizing the Patriot Act had reached a climax. A Senate filibuster against the law had been broken with an agreement that there would be new oversight protections added to the law, more reporting to Congress about how these powers were being used and under what circumstances to make sure they weren't being abused. And once again, Bush signed it in a very elaborate signing ceremony, and the story that came out of that in most of the media was, you know, Patriot Act is over, Bush has agreed to this deal, it's over. Except once again, late night, a signing statement saying, I don't have to obey any of the stuff I agreed to get this passed. And so
were these signing statements included in the material that was given to the press and the public at the time,
or did they slip it in? You would have the ceremony in the morning, the reporters would be there, the press conferences, the statements, everyone would write their story, they would go home to their kids, and 8 or 9 p.m., if they happened to check their email, there would be this press release that would sort of say in very obtuse, obscure terminology something that had to be deciphered to be understood, which was, this law does not mean what you think it means.
How did you come to realize that this was not an extraordinary act by the administration or the White House, but that it was common?
Well, so in the same way that Marty had a central role in the beginning of the church scandal, Peter Canellos, who was my editor as the Washington bureau chief at the time, now the editorial page editor at the Globe, said after the Patriot Act story, both of these stories have been remarkable and different and got a big response. Why don't you not do your ordinary, you know, incremental stuff about whatever's happening on Guantanamo for a while? Just don't write any stories. Go off and read and decipher every signing statement Bush has issued dating back to his first day in office and get a sense of the aggregate mass and the specifics of what statutes he was saying were not binding on the presidency.
At that point, how many were there?
At that point, he had issued about 150 signing statements, but because each signing statement challenged multiple different things in these sort of omnibus bills, he had challenged more than 750 statutes. By the end of his presidency, he had challenged 1,100 or so statutes, which was more than double all previous presidents in history combined. And so this wasn't a new thing, but it had ratcheted up to an enormous, intense level. And the reason was because Bush was using these legal theories, like I discussed earlier, which were very novel and aggressive. And if these theories were true, all kinds of stuff that had traditionally been understood to be normal lawmaking was in fact invalid. And so it took me about a month to process that and produce what became the sort of centerpiece. Right. Let's just march through all these laws.
Now, did you get a sense of who the invisible hand was guiding both the philosophy and the application of it? Somehow, many of us would doubt that the president himself was deeply involved in this heavily intellectual exercise.
Yes. In fact, my subsequent reporting showed that a lot of this was, the driving force behind this was Dick Cheney's chief counsel, David Addington, eventually his chief of staff after Scooter Libby was expelled. And Addington had developed these these particularly aggressive views about the scope and limits, or lack of limits on executive power, dating back to sort of the Iran-Contra scandal, and had been with Cheney through that period. There were you could see elements of it showing up when Cheney was Secretary of Defense and Addington was at his side. I think Cheney didn't really share these philosophical approach to executive power. I think Cheney had a very instrumentalist approach. He thought the president needed to be vigorous and assertive, and especially in foreign policy and national security issues. And so legal theories that made that possible were attractive to him, but he wasn't a constitutional theorist. Addington had thought deeply about these things and had developed these theories. And it was Addington who, they set up a system, in fact, where legislation that was going to be routed to the president's desk to be signed normally would go through the White House counsel's office. It also was going through the office of the vice president for flagging this, and this, and this, and this, and this.
Charlie, you've at least touched on the extreme importance of having an editor or a bureau chief or somebody in authority who can either give you the time or the resources to give something that you've spotted. And then it breaks. And forgetting prizes for a second, what's your assessment a few years later about impact? Is Obama more on guard about this sort of thing, or is the same fundamental assertion of presidential power still lurking there, regardless of how diligent people in the press are about following it now?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question that I've spent a lot of time thinking about the last 2 years and writing about.
That's why I asked it.
Yes. I mean, and it depends on sort of how you define what the problem was. Was the problem signing statements per se? That was the American Bar Association's conclusion. The president shouldn't be able to do this. You either sign it and you obey it, or you veto it. That's it. You don't sign it and then say that this part and this part are invalid. Other people took the view that that is too formalist and too rigid, and government doesn't really work that way. It's okay to have signing statements, but the problem with Bush was that he was using them as a vehicle to advance these radical theories that were false. But if you use them with modest theories that everyone agreed were basically mainstream views of how the Constitution works, it would be all right. Obama's camp, including Obama and the lawyers he surrounded himself, took the latter view, which was also the Clinton administration's view. And so Obama criticized Bush for signing statements, and he sometimes on the stump as a candidate let his audience believe that he would never use them at all. And he's to his grief now, because he gets beat up every time he issues a signing statement, even if it's totally innocuous. And sometimes they're not so innocuous. We haven't seen anything like the Unitary Executive Theory, Commander-in-Chief override power, which is the core of what was controversial about Bush.
So in other words, it goes on, and the most important lasting impact of what you've done is that we're now 5 million times more aware that it's going on, and so there is a kind of check on the activity that didn't exist before, because those late in the evening statements tended not to get reported at all.
I think so. I think the device and the theories and the institution of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, which writes these sort of secret memorandums about what's legal or not, and this is where the famous torture memos came out of, are forever changed by the last administration and the coverage of it. This administration is under the microscope in a way that the Clinton administration was not, because of what came before, and I don't see that changing. And now, as Obama deals with a Congress which is increasingly hostile to him, he lost the House. It's very likely he'll lose the Senate, even if he gets reelected in the next cycle. I think that the temptation towards unilateral assertions of power is going to be ever greater for him, and we may be seeing that right now in Libya. We probably saw that a few months ago with his decision not to defend the Defense of Marriage Act any longer, and it may just be the beginning of a plunge into something that for the first 2 years, because of the Bush experience, he was very reluctant to go.
But a topic in the news that essentially didn't exist exists today because of the work that you did.
Well, that's way overstated. I mean, a lot of people, the torture memos,
I
the
don't
terrorists,
think so.
you know, the warrantless wiretapping program, the secret CIA prisons. There was an entire constellation of national security policies put in place after 9/11 that turned out, when they surfaced, to rely on very aggressive theories about what a president could do. And all of this came together in a sort of way.
So the bit in the oath of office about taking care that the laws be faithfully executed now has a little asterisk in it that we're all aware of. Do you wish you were involved in this grubby world, or are you happy out there on cloud nine?
It's such a privilege to listen to these shows. I don't know about you guys, but it is amazing. And I think the thing that comes out is just the sheer presence of mind that you guys have to have when these things are in the making.
Yeah. But you know what
incredibly complex.
What I wanted to ask you is, while Ellen was talking a bit ago about this little germ that started to take root in her mind about a different way of thinking about things, didn't sound a little familiar to you? Because, I mean, I'm an outsider who just reads you. I never read a syllable about art in my life in newspapers. I mean, I'd read an occasional book in college to impress a girl or something, but that's right. But I didn't know bupkis. And then all of a sudden, I notice that somebody is writing about it in a really different way. And the first word that comes to mind when I think about what you do, Sebastian, is accessibility. All right? Where does this come from? Is it in the air in Australia, or?
Well, it's funny you mention Australia. I mean, I grew up there, and you can't grow up there and be interested in art without being aware of some pretty towering writers on art. And I think probably the first person that comes to mind, someone you'll all be familiar with, is Robert Hughes. I mean, and so, I mean, I don't see it, if my work is accessible, that's great. I want it to be. I don't see it as being that unusual in that sense that, there's a great tradition of art writers who are incredibly accessible. And yeah, Robert Hughes had a huge influence on me and on many other, writers, not just writers about art in Australia. And I think it's that sort of
Talk a little bit more about what the influence is so people can understand better about what you're trying to do when you write. Right. I mean, by the way, I don't know when this happened in newspapers, but technically speaking, you are the, what is it, visual arts critic? Where did that term come from?
Well, I don't know. It's
sounds almost technological.
Well, I tell you what, I think a lot of people get confused between arts, the arts, which is theater and music and film and everything else, and art. So if you say I'm an art critic, my experience anyways, a lot of people will just say, all right, so do you review, theater shows and so on? And say, no, it's just visual art. So maybe that's why.
Right. Because one of your honored colleagues, the great Mark Feeney, in a sense, when he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for criticism, the reference was to work that cut all the way across. I mean, it included performing as well as visual.
Yeah, Mark's terrific. He's amazing and writes so well, not only about photography, but film and books as well. I mean, he can write about almost anything with enormous aplomb.
But tell us some more about how you form the ideas in your mind about how to discuss art. And then tell a little bit about how you brought it to the bosses so you could get it published regularly.
Well, I started out not necessarily intending to write about art. I think the first piece I had published in a magazine in Australia was on film, on Quentin Tarantino. I think Pulp Fiction had just come out, and I was excited and wrote some pretentious piece about violence and style or something, which had no doubt been written in similar ways by lots of other people. But I did study art history. I loved it. Almost in spite of the institution where I learnt at Sydney University, which had a very sort of theory-based and philosophy-based kind of introduction to art. And I used to just hang out in the library and open these wonderful art books. And I loved the idea that you could sort of study by looking at pictures instead of reading, dense tracts. There were these writers around, not just Robert Hughes, but you know, a colleague of mine called John MacDonald, who was the chief critic at the Sydney Morning Herald at the time, and he kind of got me a job at the Herald. You know, I think I loved, what I love about art criticism is that there's a great tradition of critics who are not only engaged in visual art, but in the wider culture. You know, you go back to you know, Diderot and Baudelaire, and then, you know, forward to the many great U.S. sort of poet critics like John Ashbery, and even Peter Sheldale today, who writes in the New Yorker, is a poet as well. And then, you know, people who have their eye on the culture at large, like John Berger, like Kenneth Clark. You know, these are people who are sort of known for, and Simon Sharma, you know, they're known for specializing in art, but for also having this much broader sort of range. And I definitely don't have that, but what I love... No, I don't. But I do love the fact that if you are an art critic, you find yourself one day writing about, you know, ancient Assyrian reliefs, and then the next day about, you know, video art that was made last week. And it's dizzying, it's kind of challenging at times. But it's wonderful to sort of have this sense of the larger culture.
Let me mention one thing in particular that Sebastian does that is another reason that me, as a hack guy from Washington, can't help but read, is you go to the exhibition places and write about things in permanent collections.
Right. Well,
and you know, not the exhibit that's opening next month here, or you know, a review of another one in New York, or a gallery opening, or an auction, or something like that. But some painting that's been sitting somewhere, probably a great one, for a long time, and you have a chance to see it again for the. Where did you get that idea?
Well, you know, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to move to this part of the world is that it is so rich in great museum collections. It has, you know, museums that put on great shows all the time, but it also has these incredible collections. Obviously, I don't think many people here realize it, you know, and one of the things they don't realize is that out of the 6 sort of biggest museums in terms of size and scope of collection in the US, 2 of them are in the city, Harvard and the MFA. And then you have this amazing array of great college museums with extraordinary collections that would, you know, even though I don't want to sort of talk down Australia, it's got some wonderful museums, but there are college collections here that would embarrass almost every public collection in Australia. And so for me to come to this part of the world and get to know these collections was hugely attractive. The other thing is, you know, there's an issue as well, which is that in recent years, especially with the economic crisis, but also post 9/11, and the cost of insuring works of art, selling them all around the world for traveling exhibitions, has risen enormously by a huge factor. And so it is very difficult, increasingly difficult, for museums to bring in the kind of massive retrospectives of, you know, great impressionist painters, or, you know, whoever, the sorts of what used to be called blockbuster exhibitions that got so many people talking in the press. So one of the responses to this has been for museums to emphasize their permanent collections. And I kind of think that that's a really great thing.
But I mean, like, did some museum guy come to you and say, how come you don't? I mean, we've had this damn Rembrandt sitting here for 100 years, and nobody's written it about it.
I was not approached by any
I mean, it seems like such an obvious idea, but nobody does it.
Right. Well, you know, it's just an amazing thing that these incredible works of art that have been accumulated over centuries, or a century and often more, they're just sitting around. And
so you tried it one day?
We take them for granted.
So you tried it one day?
Do
you remember
writing about?
Yeah. Do you remember what was the first one you took
there was a work
batting practice
at the
on?
Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, a wonderful museum out in the Berkshires. But you know, I had actually suggested it to my editors a while before they agreed to it.
Really? What was the reluctance?
I don't know. Maybe they were just busy and understandable, and that's totally fine.
We can all relate to that,
yeah,
right?
but you know, perhaps the idea of sort of making it a really regular thing, I think editors understandably are reluctant commit themselves to those sorts of things.
Yeah.
You need to see how it's going to
Now,
work.
you've heard some stories of remarkable commitment.
Yeah.
There are also stories of remarkable non-commitment. And there is nothing more familiar to everybody on this stage than the poor slob trying to convince an editor to please let him or her do something that's a little off the beaten track. Persistence, or your example of how to do it really worked? How did you get it established?
Look, it was just a question of coming back on a better day. About 12 months later.
We know that, Phil.
Yeah. No, look, I have to say, I've had enormous support from my editors, both my direct editor Scott Heller and now Rebecca Ostraker, and from Marty and from the whole hierarchy at the Globe. I really have, and that's one of the things that I have to say. I've worked for a whole bunch of newspapers. I've worked for the Sydney Morning Herald. I lived for 4 years in London. I wrote for every one of the broadsheets there: the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, the FT, the Times. I'm not saying I wrote a lot for all these places. The Telegraph, I wrote, but I contributed on a freelance basis to all of those publications. And then I went back to Australia, to the Australian, where I was the art critic. The standards at the Globe and the editorial support that I get beat all of those places.
Have you had I mean, it's only been a little while, and this is certainly as big a splash as I've seen in a while for someone who just got here. But do you realize the shoulders that you stand on in that little department of yours? I think of Ellen's column first being there, but just in the last...
More interesting, too, to think about how many newspapers now have a full-time art critic.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Are there maybe 30?
It's getting less, absolutely.
Maximum?
Fewer.
It's just like the public schools. The music and the art has suffered greatly.
And so one of the things that I'm just so grateful for is that a newspaper like the Globe has space for all these incredibly important things, and it makes what I do often feel really paltry. Listening to these stories is just amazing. But I love that there is a space for what I do and for what my colleagues do. I mean, I joined the most amazing team. Mark Feeney had just won a Pulitzer just as I arrived from Australia. And you've got Matthew Gilbert, you've got Sarah Rodman, you've got the film critics Wesley and Ty. I mean, it's an amazing...
Ellen and I are of a certain age, and I drink Geritol. By the way, anybody wants to go to a microphone to ask questions, please start. But what
the year that
Gale is 2001,
yeah,
right?
and there was a TV critic.
Bill Henry. Rest his soul.
Bill Henry won the year that I won.
Right. Winship 4 on that day.
Wow. But a television critic to win the Pulitzer was extremely unusual.
And it led to it happening 3 times. But it started at the Globe.
But one of the interesting questions about art criticism is not just how few art critics there are in the country, which is true, but the audience. And that you do not have an automatic audience it's not like the sports page. Even though everybody's here and not watching the Bruins, or the Bruins tomorrow night. I'm sports director.
Whatever. Why do you think they're here tonight? Whatever.
I apologize. They would have been, but you have to build an audience as well as respond to one. It's not automatically there.
That's true, perhaps up to a point, But I do think people underestimate how great the thirst for engagement with art out there is. I mean, you look at the numbers of people who go to the MFA and to the Gardner and the ICA.
Or who try to paint themselves.
And who try to paint themselves. I mean, it's actually pretty incredible.
Now, have you had a sense in, what's it been, a month and a half? The confetti is still on you a little bit. But have you had a sense that the foundation under which you work has had some concrete poured into it because of this? Can you feel the opportunity that this confers?
Look, you know, I can't honestly say I have. I mean, I got an email from Amy McDonald inviting me here tonight, and I wasn't sure what on earth to talk about, because I was told it would be about, you know, life post-Pulitzer, and I said, you know, my life is uncannily like my life before. But obviously it's been enormously, you know, boosting and cheering, and you know, nothing big has happened. I got a letter from the Prime Minister of Australia, which I thought that was pretty cool.
That's pretty good.
It made me disappointed that I haven't got one from the president.
It is cool.
Yet, so.
I mean, I don't know what Ellen thinks. I think over time, it's not that it fades, it's just that perspective arrives. I mean, the only thing I have left, the night of the announcement of the gold medal for the coverage of busing, Winship had decreed there could be no celebration at the paper because the town was a wreck. It had been an emotionally wrenching year of 14-hour days just repeated over and over again, so there would be no celebration. But we did end up at the Harvard Club about midnight, drunk as rats. And he gave me a Lilly Pulitzer bow tie. And it's all I got.
Well, I think that there is one thing that all of us got from winning the Pulitzer, and that is that we know the first line of our obit.
Let me ask you something. As a Geritol drinker, sometimes I find the phrase used so much, I'm not sure it has the, I mean, I wish, I don't know, maybe somebody say I wrote about the Brooklyn Dodgers once or something. Does the phrase still make you tingle a little bit?
I would agree with Sebastian that I think if you win a Pulitzer, perhaps for writing a play, and that play contains the, you know, the fine print with it all the way through, and it's done. And so, yeah, but if you're writing for a newspaper, it's like, oh my God, do I have to get up tomorrow morning and write a Pulitzer Prize-winner column? You know, I mean.
Do you feel that already?
Do you feel that yet? Like that.
The so-called "What have you done for me lately?"
I had the good fortune that I had already taken a book leave and was sort of already moving into another project.
Good for you.
That I could throw myself into. But I remember I've talked to several winners, and there's a sense of just you're kind of wrecked for some time afterwards, and you have to sort of get your life back to normalcy.
Well, you'll be all right. Just
no, I'm not.
And last one, Robbie. It's an ongoing story. It's an absolute horror show. It's kind of like us and busing. You can't. There's nothing to rejoice in. There's some feeling, you know, that, you know, maybe you did some good and all the rest of it. But how do you really feel? As they say on local television.
Well, you know, I think that for us, the reason we got into this business is because we thought that journalism matters, that good journalism matters a lot, and that investigative reporting, which is what I do, can make a difference. And I think in the case, certainly, of the extraordinary Globe effort in the church, it turned out everything that we had thought of turned out to be true. That in fact, reporting, shining a bright light into dark corners, can really make a difference for people's lives. And that's why we do what we do.
I still think so. Yeah. Thank you very much for your patience. Please.
Tom, could you give us a backstory on your Pulitzer?
Yeah.
Well, that again is institutional, and it again, we paraphrase Robbie a little bit, we stand on the shoulders of great people. When Arthur Garrity made his decision that the Boston school system was guilty as hell, of operating a dual school system, Tom Winship and two tailors recognized that the most horrendous thing imaginable was just 4 months away. And so Winship got us all ready, the entire institution, for what would be, in the first year, 9 months of 14-hour days, 7 days a week. His philosophy in setting this thing up was that we were going to hold up a giant mirror in front of the city and force it to look at itself. And there would be ugly things, maybe a couple of good things, but mostly really ugly things to look at for a long time, and that public officials were likely to be at best on the sidelines, at worst part of the problem. The hardest thing in this story was keeping the effort going night after night, day after day. And at the same time, Winship was a horrid slave driver, had me working with two reporters to do a behind-the-scenes reconstruction of the first year of busing that would ultimately run 100,000 words at the same time we were running the coverage of it. So when it was all over, we checked into a rest home, and I've been there ever since. Yes, ma'am.
I just think the whole program has been terrific, and congratulations. I actually had quite a few comments as a practicing Catholic. A big thank you to Mr. Robinson, and but I'd really like to get together with all of you in that saloon and discussion war stories. But I think because right now I'd like to talk to you all, but I think the most vital question tonight was what Mr. Savage was saying. And I know about the signing statements, but I did not follow it in detail. And I wondered, first of all, as a non-lover of Bush, I'll say that right now. I'm sure most of the people here feel the same way. But I just want to say it seems like he was even worse than Nixon, whom I remember well, and as a danger to the Constitution and the safety of the country. And I just wondered, have you thought about writing a book about the signing statements? Because it's very suspenseful.
Funny you should ask.
Yeah. It's currently ranked about 600,000 on Amazon, but you...
Oh, sorry.
You can buy a copy. It's called Takeover.
Yeah.
It's not just about signing statements. It has a chapter about signing statements. It's about the growth of executive power, generally after Watergate and then its acceleration under the last administration.
Well, I have a book.
And the publisher is?
Little Brown.
And you can get it on Amazon. Right?
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for being patient.
Well, first of all, it's an absolute honor to be here. I grew up reading the Globe, and Ellen, your columns were just must-read. And when my wife moved here from Kansas, we both sort of saw the Boston Globe as so instrumental to our political and social understanding of both local and national news. Ellen, I wanted to ask you, in regard to your columns, were there particular things that would stand out to you that you sort of say, oh, gee, this would be worth writing about? And then I think that the secondary part of the question would be, what were you hoping to be able to sort of show people in regard to the writing that you were doing? Was there particular things that you wanted to sort of get across in particular? I know that you mentioned earlier about the personal and political, but was there other underlying issues that you wanted to really expose with your daily...
Well, I suppose if you had to put a subject line over my column, what I was writing about, what I have written about during my life, I would call it values. And so when stories came from the news, and generally speaking, as a columnist, you get stuff that is in the news, it was the stories that had some values nut, some question. What does it mean? How do we explain it? How do we think about this in terms of the culture that we live in and the values that we hold dear? And can you wrest some meaning from what is happening? So I would try to pick those, and I would try to get to the heart of it, often tipping my hat to people who agreed and tipping my hat to people who disagreed along the way, and figure out a puzzle. What is it in this story that we need to understand and unravel? So that would be at the heart of it for the most part. And the subjects that I picked, the things that interested me personally, had to do with the culture that we live in, loosely defined, and particularly the women's movement, defined in its largest term, which is the movement of men and women from one life pattern to many. So those would be, and I wrote a lot about ethics, but again, generally speaking, it would be the search for understanding and questioning what value was stuck in the heart of this story.
Let me back up your premise with two short little stories about Ellen. First of all, I remember something. Well, I remember something our mutual mentor, Winship, said about her, that Tom always believed that the real lasting legacy of the 1960s was not political, that it was personal, that the most important thing that changed during that decade were the nature of people's relationships to each other, particularly ones that had previously been hierarchical. Kids learning how to talk back to their parents better, husbands and wives being at least in a somewhat different situation, and that Ellen's work embodied this lasting cultural legacy. It was put much more succinctly by a very dear friend of Ellen's and of mine named Frank Mankiewicz, who's married to a very close friend of Ellen's, Patricia O'Brien, whom Robbie remembers very well from national politics. And Frank once said, he had been Bob Kennedy's press secretary, among other things, that the 1970s in op-ed world belonged primarily to the Washington scene, the Nixon Wars, Vietnam, and stuff like that. The 80s belonged to her, because that personal
I don't want to take
quote.
That
No. Well, he said it. He said it.
Reagan,
and,
please.
Yeah, far more than to Reagan. And what the Pulitzer Committee was trying to encourage, and it's still, I think, an effort, Ellen, is to get more of that. You know, I would rather have 5 more Ellens and 5 less of me. For just the sake of the national dialogue. Probably sell more papers, too. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Drew Horn. I'm from Weymouth, and I have a question about journalism for all 5 of you. And the question comes from a concern of mine, and that is that it's been my observation that the country has been unable to come to consensus about where it wants to go and what it wants to be. When I was growing up and became an adult, it was the 1950s, and there were 3 networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and there were about 5 major national newspapers, and everybody got their information from those sources, and they all had pretty much the same information. And today, with the diffusion of information coming from every place, from the internet, from the airwaves, from cable, from here and there, it seems as though we have such a diffusion and such a separation between people as a result of people not having the same information. They listen to echo chambers about what they think instead of listening to each other.
Okay, I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative and give this one to our new arrival.
So
I'm going to alter your question just a little bit. so that I could get you to talk about this American cultural media informational scene that you find yourself in the middle of and that is now turned around and put a big halo over your head.
My question is, do you have any recommendations how we can fix the problem?
Well, maybe fewer Australians.
Well, I can
I'm thinking of one in particular by the name of Rupert Murdoch, but I shouldn't say that because he's my former employer. He was the owner of The Australian, which was the newspaper in Australia I worked for. Anyway, the echo chamber, sir, it's a very good point, a good question. I suppose that many people could make the counter-argument, though, which is that the diffusion of sources of media is a great thing for our democracy. So I know what you're talking about exactly, though, the echo chamber phenomenon. We can all see it. People are just speaking to those who have the same opinions as they do already. And you get this fragmenting and splintering of the body politic. I can't say anything profound about it. I do think that despite the sort of economic problems it brings to newspapers, that there is so much that is great about the diffusion of media sources. I think all of us as journalists use these proliferating sources every day. So it would be a bit rich to be hypercritical of them. But I think one of the great things about newspapers is that they still have the ability to bring together all of these opposing and often sort of incredibly kind of self-involved voices. You can go to a newspaper, a great newspaper that has some sense of values and of objectivity and so on, like the Boston Globe, and get a whole bunch of different voices. I think that is actually going to be one of the great strengths of newspapers as they go forward.
Thank you.
Sir.
Let's be honored to have opportunity to question Mr. Walter Robinson. Just once you face the very strong organization, I mean the religion organization like the Catholic Church, are you afraid of them? If I'm going back to China and doing the story of a Shaolin Temple become to corporation, the product become the CEO, some kind of that kind of story. If I also face the very strong organization, the religious organization, what do you advise for me?
If I understand your question, how do you do this?
While you're doing the story, you're facing the very strong the Catholic religion organization, the Catholic Church. Are you afraid? What make you go forward for the story?
I think what animates all of us every day is to dig out the truth. And even if it's a religion that you or I and I was raised in, if the truth hurts, so be it. But the public has a right to know what the institutions that it reveres are doing. And I think we have an obligation to hold them accountable. And I think that's our primary obligation.
So doing the investigation is very difficult, to get the truth. Or how you find the truth? So for the Catholic Church, I mean the Catholic Church going on for 1,000 years,
In our particular case, we talked to hundreds and hundreds of people. And sometimes they were very, very difficult conversations. But hundreds of people who had been victims of priests, just in this archdiocese, called us and wanted to tell us their stories. And that, plus our success, obviously, in getting a judge to agree that the public had a right to the documents, helped us get this story out.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for waiting.
Yeah, no problem.
as brief as possible so we can squeeze in as many as
Absolutely.
possible.
So both the profession and the business of journalism have changed as a result of technological advances in the last few years pretty dramatically. How do you see that continuing to change over the next few years, and what are your hopes as journalists in terms of what you hope the outcome will be 5 to 10 years down the road in terms of the profession?
Okay, Savage, you're the future.
People high above me in the business side of the New York Times, of course, have launched the pay-metered model, and some other papers have, well, I think the Globe too now. When I go to the Globe, it keeps telling me I have to subscribe, and I'm like, what? Don't I get alumni rights? And so I'm hoping that this sort of hybrid approach, not where people sort of get sucked in with 20 articles a month or something, works when everything until now has not worked. And so fingers crossed. Other than that, I'm an ink-stained wretch, not a business guy, so I don't know. I just hope.
But you have to live with it.
Well, sure.
Ellen, what's your impression of all this? I'm fascinated to know how you view...
Well, I'm interested because, of course, we represent here an award that is only given to print.
Yes. They now have, they've expanded the definition now so that online material, right, Marty? Yeah, online material may be considered, whatever that is.
But I will be interested if the next major investigative piece gets awarded to, say, WikiLeaks or something, how does the profession adjust to that when the news is coming in handheld video cameras from Egypt, while America is cutting back foreign bureaus, and how much of citizen journalism just this chaotic, unedited, unvetted source of information? How do we contain and direct and improve it? It's a little bit like going to the internet when you have a medical problem.
Right.
And if you Google, meniscus tear, to pick something in the family.
That's some knee part, right? Yeah.
You can get total junk, or you can get something that is useful. And so I think one of the big problems is going to be figuring out ways for both people and for journalism as an institution to contain, edit, and vet this huge inrush of information.
It was behind the earlier question too, when the gentleman, where do I go?
Yeah.
Sir.
I have a related question about investigative journalism in particular. Investigative journalism is relatively modern as we know it now, so I'm wondering, as the media changes and as more media is going to the personal, much more accessible news, will there still be investigative journalism and these long, drawn-out investigations as we know it?
One of the reasons that the Pulitzer Prizes were aimed at this kind of work, starting in various forms about 40 years ago, was to encourage it. Robbie, how many joints have teams? Let's use that as a criterion. 5, 6?
Formal, separate teams. The Post, the Globe, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, Seattle. But many papers don't invest the resources because it's expensive. The Globe, in my view, the Globe's dedication to this kind of reporting is unflinching because the editor and the publisher believe in it, and because here in Boston we recognize that this is what our readers want. And let me give you one example. I don't know if there was a verdict today in the trial of Sal DeMacy, but one thing I will tell you, I don't know if you know this, he would never have been indicted or come to the attention of federal prosecutors had it not been for reporting by the Boston Globe, which dug out, okay? And for, just to make one personal point, having been doing this since the 1970s, every time someone says to me, You're the liberal democratic Globe. That's what you represent. What I say is the Globe very often in this state is the opposition party and has held those in power accountable. So the importance of that kind of reporting, whether it's done by a team like the Spotlight team, which has been in place for 40 years, or the half-dozen reporters who do it in the newsroom full-time, or the State House Bureau, which dug out a lot of the Selda Macy stuff. It's what we do. It's why we publish every day. It's what's important to readers because, you know, we sometimes can't trust the institutions that govern us to do things right.
There are new models too, Tom. You should mention. Well, Robbie has a new model of his own.
Yes, right.
Partnering with his students at Northeastern. Then there is a new
Northwestern
model.
Is
the new model of ProPublica and the Center for Investigative Reporting. It's where newspapers are taking the work that is done by, you know, supported nonprofit investigative reporting.
There was a unit at Northwestern that specialized in capital cases.
That's right, there is.
And so there'll probably be, right, Charlie, all kinds of new forms over the next decade. Have you had any experience so far with experimental or new, different ways of probing behind headlines? It's still you're in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, I'm an avid, you were saying, look, we all make use of this proliferating online media, so it'd be hypocritical to criticize it unduly. I mean, I'm an avid consumer of specialized blogs, in particular law professor blogs are of enormous help to me in sort of surveying the world and trying to make sense of it. That would be one great example.
It would. Let's take... I hate this part of the job, and I'm going to say, if you can be brief, we'll do two, okay?
Mr. Smee, would you, in the wake of the problems with Deborah Jowett at the Village Voice, she's been accused of not criticizing dance, but rather illuminating it. Would you comment on the term critic when it comes to art?
Right. I've heard a little about that. I don't know the details really well, but I'll be brief myself in my answer. I mean, I think it is a very important part of the job. Readers are expecting an opinion from us, you know, if we're critics. And if you are too afraid to offer that opinion, then you're not really doing your job. It's not necessarily the most important part of the job, or it's not the most interesting part of the job. But I do think a lot of critics make the mistake of sitting on the fence and not offering an opinion. So, you know, I think a lot of people think, well, they need to be the village explainer, the educator of the public. And I think that's an enormous mistake because, you know, first of all, especially in a town like Boston, there's always going to be a whole bunch of people out there who know more than you do about the subject. And also, you know, it makes the writing less interesting. You know, that can be a big part of what you do, but you really do need to have an opinion. And so, you know, it's one part of well, there are other parts of the paper too, but it's not the final word on anything, but it's a great way to start a debate by having an opinion.
And to you, right behind you. Thanks for being so patient.
Oh, right. Thanks. Sorry, I'll try to be brief. This might be also more for Sebastian. I'm sure you all sort of follow the British press occasionally, and you might be aware that they've been issuing super injunctions against the press. I mean, these are the judges, that is. I mean, essentially gagging the press because of this new privacy article that is in the European Convention of Human Rights. So, for instance, the Daily Mail is often being gagged. You know, they cannot publish a story, mostly about a celebrity. Right. You know, so I'm wondering what you think about that. And again, with the British press, because a lot of them are attracting more American viewers on their websites, and the Daily Mail has just increased their presence in New York. Do you think this is going to increase, or rather decrease the credibility and accuracy of the press in general? You know, less fact-checking as we're known for, and a lot of others aren't.
I'm wondering why you're directing the question at me.
Well, no, only because you worked in the, you worked.
Because I was in London.
Yes, yes.
Right, of course, right. Well, yeah, right.
But no, it could be for any of you.
You're a foreigner.
It's a good question. I really don't feel I can speak to it with any authority at all. I mean, obviously the papers in the UK are a very special beast, those tabloids. And
also a very different legal background.
Yeah, exactly.
And legal tradition.
And maybe that's what you're asking about, how that plays out here.
In this country, one of the most unfortunate trends, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm essentially an anarchist on the question, has been a tendency to respect and obey injunctions. I was raised to look for ways to disobey them, and hopefully that'll return. The thought I want to leave you with is, who knows why people read newspapers? I don't think it's just for an investigation or a Bruin score or a signing statement or to understand relationships or to understand fields of human expression. It's all the above and more. But for all the bad that we do, there really is a flip side, and I hope you've gotten a little sense of it this evening, and I leave you with a great thought from my favorite philosopher, Mick Jagger. Said, it's only rock and roll, but I like it. Thank you very much.